All right. Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started and we'll let people continue to join. Thank you all so much for joining the policy brief on the New York City budget with Preston Niblack, Deputy Comptroller for Budget at the Office of the New York City Comptroller. We're so grateful to have you all here today. Deputy Comptroller Niblack will walk us through some insights of the fiscal year 2021 budget, followed by a moderated Q&A based on submitted questions and live audience Q&A at the end. Feel free to submit your questions throughout the session via the Q&A function. Please remember to spread the word about ABNY on social media, tagging us at @BetterNY. I will now pass the screen to our wonderful YP host, Alex Gleason, Director of Policy Research and Legislation at the New York City Central Labor Council and ABNY YP Steering Committee member. Take it away. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Sarah. My name is Alex Gleason, and I am the Director of Policy and Legislation at the Central Labor Council. I'm also on faculty at SUNY at the Harry Van Arsdale Center and adjunct occasionally at NYU in the New School. I'm here with Preston Niblack, the Deputy Comptroller for Budget, to talk about New York City's current budget, ongoing budget issues. So a bit about Preston. He's responsible for overseeing the work of the Budget Bureau, including monitoring of the city's fiscal health and cash position, analyzing and reporting on the city budget, and issuing reports on various budgetary and economic issues. Prior to joining the Comptroller's office, Mr. Niblack served as Director of the Finance Division for the New York City Council for 6 years under Speaker Christine Quinn. In this capacity, he oversaw a staff of 30 in their annual budget review, budget approval process, and fiscal analysis of the legislation and other proposals. He was also the lead negotiator on the city budget on behalf of the City Council and developed legislative and policy initiatives in budget and tax policy, housing, economic development, and other areas. Prior to this role, Mr. Niblack was Deputy Director at the New York City Independent Budget Office for 8 years, providing fiscal oversight and analysis of the city budget, most recently serving as Senior Advisor within the New York City Government and Regulatory Division of Mannett, Phelps, and Phillips, LLP. Mr. Niblack has a PhD and an MPA in Policy Sciences from the University of Maryland School of Public Policy and a BA from Middlebury College. And before I pass the baton, I just have a couple comments too that they asked me to prepare that I wrote that I meant to mention too, which is just to set the context of the stage. A little over a year ago, New York City had historic employment and economic growth, with the prospect of COVID-19 reaching the United States at a fleeting threat at best to most people. Let's fast forward to the present moment. We have seen months of stagnant economic activity, sickness, death, and heartbreak. We're all grappling with the frightening reality of what shutting down an entire economy means for our businesses, families, government, as well as our emotional and physical health. Our present moment is categorized by pain and hardship. It is a time that is unique to history and will require the collective imagination of our thinking and effort to rescue this economy from the brink. I'm thrilled to be hosting this discussion. These types of crises are literally why ABNY was created. It was created with a collective recognition by industries and advocates of the city's political circles in the fiscal crisis of the 70s to say we need serious discourse. The event today marks just one of the many in the ongoing discussions unfolding around this crisis that ABNY, by the way, is being a leader on in all of those. But our collective recognition that everyone is a part of the problem will help all of us to craft a solution that saves the city. It may be overblown and dramatic to contend New York City is dead, but to say that its soul and heart are at risk is fair. Luckily, people like all of us are committed to the city and will not let that happen. So thank you again, and please enjoy hearing Preston.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you, Melva, and for having me, and Laura, my old friend Laura, and Sarah and Alex, and thank you, Alex, for that introduction. I'm going to put some slides up on the screen. Give me 1 second. So, as promised, I'm going to talk a little bit about this year's budget, give an overview of this year's budget, and talk a little bit about the outlook for the city. As Alex mentioned, back as recently as February, the city was really enjoying literally the best economy on record. We had uninterrupted growth for several years since the end of the Great Recession, resulting in private employment that reached 4.1 million jobs, the highest number of jobs ever in the city, and an unemployment rate amongst New York City residents of 3.4%, which was the lowest rate on record, literally. And that performance extended to all demographic groups. Every group was at their lowest unemployment rate on record. All of this growth had enabled the city to, and it enabled Mayor de Blasio in particular to really expand the range of services that the city had offered, including most notably the introduction of a whole new grade to the Department of Education, pre-K, and other initiatives such as more efforts to find ways to address homelessness, to provide mental health services to underserved populations, et cetera. At the same time, we had been able to beef up our reserves, adding $1 billion a year in budgeted contingency reserves and increasing the surplus in the Retiree Health Benefit Trust, which I'll talk more about in a moment, to $4.8 billion. So that tax growth which had averaged 5.7% over the last annually over the last 10 years had benefited us greatly in terms of our ability to expand services and our ability to pad our reserves somewhat for a contingency like the one that came that nobody foresaw. We literally went almost overnight. I'm sorry, I keep saying literally, and I hate doing that, but we went overnight almost from the best economy on record to the worst economy on record. In the space of about 4 weeks, the city lost 900,000 jobs, or almost all of the jobs that it had gained during the course of the expansion since the end of the Great Recession. And the unemployment rate, which had been at 3.4%, an historic low, rose to 20%, an historic high. What that meant for our city's tax revenues was a drastic revision downward in terms of what we expected. When the mayor had introduced his preliminary budget for fiscal year 2021 back in January, we expected almost $66 billion in tax revenues. At that time, nobody had barely heard of the coronavirus. We'd obviously heard of it, but there had been no recorded cases yet. And there was nothing looming on the horizon to suggest that there was going to be a big impact. In the space, as I said, of a few weeks, that all turned around. By the time the budget was adopted in June for fiscal year 2021, the fiscal year starts on July 1st. The tax revenue forecast had been revised downward by $7 billion. Wasn't just the taxes that gone down that had created a problem. In the meantime, the state passes its budget on a much shorter cycle than the city does. The budget is introduced by the governor at about the same time as the mayor's preliminary budget in January, but the state's fiscal year starts on April 1st. So by April 1st, the state had enacted a budget that reflected, at least partially, the impact of the coronavirus on the state's economy and finances. And part of the way the state always resolves its budget problems is taking it out of the city. So we had state budget cuts that amounted to almost $800 million in the course of for the course of fiscal year 2021. And new spending needs that most of which really were related to the pandemic, but not necessarily covered by federal aid, altogether leaving us with a budget gap that had to be addressed of $8.3 billion. So how did we deal with that budget gap? First, we had reserves that we've drawn on. We have budgeted reserves of about $1 billion or $1.25 billion in each year. We drew those down. We also drew down funding from the city's Retiree Health Benefit Trust. So the Retiree Health Benefit Trust was created in 2006. I'm thinking of something else, 2006. And all of health benefits to city retirees are paid through it. The city makes a deposit each year equal to the amount of the benefits that are due. And if in a good year, we can make a deposit that's greater than that amount and build up, accumulate surplus balances in the trust. So we had $4.8 billion in the trust. We used $1 billion in fiscal year 20 to close that gap that emerged at the end of last year. And then another $1.6 billion is due to be used this year. So $2.6 billion over the course of 2 years, 1.6 in 21. So that was a big draw on reserves. That was about a third of the total. Another roughly a third of the total came from a savings program that relied, as it often does, heavily on a number of actions that are fairly easy to achieve, including some reestimates of spending. A big portion of it came from vacancy reductions in the city's workforce. A big savings came from the expectation that some jails on Rikers Island will be closed due to declining capacity needs, and a number of other actions, including refinancing of debt, et cetera. So a wide range of actions that resulted in a savings program. A lot of the savings program this year and at the end of last year relied on the suspension of programs that were simply not able to go forward because of COVID. So schools closed, so there was less need for busing, for school food, for classroom maintenance. Senior centers were closed, et cetera. There were a whole bunch of program closures and other delays that were not necessarily strictly due to COVID, but which resulted in some one-time savings. We have some federal aid this year, primarily in the form of savings in our Medicaid spending, which we share with the state. The mayor also included a unspecified $1 billion in labor savings in each year of the 4-year financial plan, as well as an assumption that the first 2 years of the next round of contract settlements with the city's labor unions would be either self-financed through some form of savings or give back, or simply be zero. Those savings were not specified. It was a big risk in the budget, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then finally, we had a surplus of about $1.1 billion from fiscal year 20 that we were able to use to help close that gap. So altogether, that was how we closed that $8.3 billion gap for fiscal year 21 when the budget was adopted, meaning that the budget, as it must be, was adopted balanced. It still leaves some out-year gaps and risks. So why is this significant? The 4-year financial plan that it is incorporated since the fiscal crisis of the mid-1970s into sort of how we budget in New York City. Typically, when we get to sort of the first quarter budget modification, which comes in November, typically, we are looking at not just this year and how to keep this year in balance, but next year. So next year is fiscal year 2022. In the November budget modification, the budget gap that's projected for right now is $3.8 billion. There are some risks that are, I'm just going to highlight two of the main ones here that weigh on sort of how much room for maneuver we have. The first one really is the labor savings that I mentioned earlier, $1 billion a year in each year of the financial plan. As of now, there have been some deferrals you may have heard about of funds that were due to labor unions for a combination of retroactive one-time payments on contracts and contributions to what are called supplemental welfare benefit funds, which have been pushed out into next year. So that resulted in reducing that labor savings, $1 billion labor savings risk this year to about $340 million. That risk still exists in next year and the following years, that $1 billion, because as of yet, there have been no actual permanent recurring labor savings that have been negotiated with the unions. Police overtime. So the budget that was enacted in June was, there was a tremendous amount of pressure on the city council in the wake of Black Lives Matter protests to defund the police. And there were calls to defund the police by $1 billion. And there were even some statements by the mayor and the city council that they had done that. They did not. The single biggest change that they made in the police budget was to assume that police overtime spending would be held below $300 million. Police overtime spending has not been below $300 million since, probably sometime in the 1990s. It typically runs at about 19% of police basic salaries. And if you assume that that will be the case again this year, then you have about a $400 million unrecognized $400 million police overtime liability that will have to be at some point made up. I don't know what the spending is so far on police overtime at this point, but it is extremely unlikely that just even in the normal course of events, you would be able to hold police overtime to less than $300 million this year. So how do we deal with these gaps? Normally, as I said, when it comes to in the first quarter budget modification, which is the November plan that was just released last week, the city takes the approach of instituting what used to be called a PEG program. PEG stands for Program to Eliminate the Gap, which is a term that goes back to the sort of aftermath of the fiscal crisis, that attempts to achieve some savings in the current year as well as the next year. So the current year savings are essentially to build up a surplus that can be used to help balance next year. So you'll recall that we had a surplus from fiscal year 20 that we rolled into fiscal year 21 to help close the gap. Similarly, you would expect that something like that would occur through a combination of higher than budgeted taxes and a savings program. So far this year, we have enjoyed a very substantial we've had revenues that have run substantially ahead of plan. As of September, we were $800 million over what we had assumed would be our tax revenues for the year. Another mechanism that we often use to help balance the budget is debt service savings. By that, I mean that when we refinance outstanding bonds that we've issued to pay for our capital program at a lower interest rate. Interest rates, of course, are historically low right now. So that allows us to refinance and save some money. This year, we've saved already, we have in hand $470 million in debt service savings with another $200 million essentially in the works. So we have substantial resources. I mean, those two items alone add up to about $1.5 billion. That said, those are resources that are typically used to cover some expenses that may have arisen in the course of the current year. So for example, the expenses associated with reopening schools and keeping schools clean and safe. And some of that will be used also to help address next year's budget gap. So that's a fair amount of resources in hand, and the budget gap was really not significantly reduced. It was $4.2 billion before. Now in the November plan, it was reduced by about $400 million to $3.8 billion. No PEG program, no savings program was announced or implemented. So we still have a fairly substantial gap, and eventually we're going to run out of time to deal with it. We are, as I say, in reasonably good shape at this point. We have substantial reserves left. It's a manageable gap. We have substantial reserves. We have revenues that are running ahead of plan. We have some planned debt service savings. With the implementation of a modest PEG program, it should be a reasonably manageable gap. What are the risks in addition to those that I've already showed? The risks include that we get, there are a couple of different kinds of risks. One is what I'll call a virus/economic risk. That really is, we're already starting to see some of that nationally and a little bit of that here. We haven't really seen shutdowns yet that affect businesses, but we have seen people's behavior change that affects businesses. Obviously, with the advent of cold weather, the opportunities for outside dining are going to diminish. So there's a real risk, and I think we are seeing it already, that economic activity is going to stagnate over the course of the winter. Our recovery, as I mentioned, we lost 900,000 jobs. We have recovered about 35% of those jobs. So we have a long ways to go still in terms of our economic recovery. We are still seeing very substantial numbers of New Yorkers applying for unemployment insurance. So we are far from out of the woods. The biggest, brightest hope, of course, is that there's a vaccine that becomes widely available, and that will enable people to resume a level of normal activity, whatever normal is. And I won't get into what that might be yet, but oops, didn't mean to do that. So, but the biggest risk really is that there's not an economic stimulus package from the federal government. Now, if you read the New York Times this morning, you saw that there was a bit of hope that this $900 million package that was put forward by a bipartisan group of senators might actually gain some traction. We'll see. If we don't have something by really the end of this year, we're going to have a big problem on our hands, because there are a lot of benefits that will lapse, and the article did a good job of sort of laying out all the programs, including the pandemic unemployment assistance, extended benefits, and some other programs that are at risk of lapsing at the end of this month if they're not renewed and extended. So I think there's a lot of pressure to do it, but it may be kind of a minimal package that will not provide a great deal of relief to state and local governments who have suffered tremendously in the last several months, because we're on the front lines of having to respond to the emergency. We're also on the front lines of the shutdowns in terms of our revenues, and that's resulted in hundreds of billions of dollars of lost revenues across the country. So I don't know whether we will get much federal aid. This is a manageable gap, I think, on our part without it. But the big risk that looms over us is the state budget. At this point, the state is looking at very significant gaps that they will have limited options to fix, except by reducing local aid. And if we get local aid cuts, then we will have a whole new problem on our hands, especially since about 2/3 of state aid to New York City goes to the Department of Education for K through 12 or pre-K through 12 schooling. So I think that's the main risk right now. Let me stop because I see Alex just appeared, which I think was a signal.
No. You can keep going. No, please.
Right. But let me stop, and we can, if people have questions, we can answer some of those. And if people don't have questions, then I can keep babbling for a while, no doubt. So.
Oh, looks like there might be a question here, so let me see. Yep, so here we go. What are the prospects for a post-vaccine economic boom? What would lead to a full recovery in the city and state budgets?
So I think our view right now is that a vaccine that is widely available, that ultimately engenders a feeling that people can return to some semblance of normal activity, will be sufficient to really spark a full recovery. The question is really sort of how long does it take? What's the timeline? How much damage has been done in the meantime? And I think that's the big concern right now is you have, hundreds, if not thousands of businesses that have closed, that are not going to reopen. And, what will take their place? How long will it be before there is a full revival of tourism? The arts and entertainment sector, which is significant in the city, and which is the one sector who has seen no recovery, whose decline in employment just continues every month, really is at risk of suffering some long-term damage here. People are just not, actors, producers, stage set designers, all the people who work in this industry and have not been able to work for the last 8 months and will not be able to work through at least Memorial Day next year. Some of them are simply not going to be able to stay in New York City under the circumstances, and you have a risk of a real talent drain there.
Preston, thank you so much for saying that. I just have to say, we have 89,000 members across the performing arts, and people, I'm so happy you brought this up, and I just want to underscore so folks understand the economic arrangement of the performing arts industry in New York. It's very much like construction. It's very much like the service industries where if you don't work, you don't get paid. And so when we have economic shutdown, full scale economic shutdown, where you can't actually feasibly open, you have large swaths of people who not only can't work, but are ineligible for benefits, right? Traditional unemployment and other benefits that would be key to their survival. And thank you for mentioning that talent loss, because it's really alarming.
It is alarming, and it's. I was sat in with the Comptroller a few weeks ago on a meeting he had with the organization that I'm forgetting, COBUG, I think, right? That represents all of the Broadway unions, and it was an alarming story. There's no question, and I think it's a big. It's an important sector for us in many ways, but there are others. I expect employment will return in most sectors within the space of a couple of years, once there is a widespread vaccine that's widely available. But I don't know if every sector will come back to its full pre-pandemic. So let's take office workers, for example. I suspect that all the jobs will come back. The question is, will they come back to New York City? I don't expect that they will. I don't know how. It's very hard to say what percentage of people who previously worked in offices will not come back to the office, will continue to work remotely. Businesses may decide that this model works and that they don't need it. I think, my own sense is, from what I've heard in my own experience in my own office, really, is that the knowledge economy that is core to New York City's economic success in the last decade thrives on interaction. And, I think everybody's come to realize that Zoom interaction is not entirely satisfactory. And I think people are eager to be able to resume in-person interaction. But it may not be essential for everybody. And so, a lot will depend on how that shakes out in the end. And it's in ways that it's impossible, honestly, to predict right now. I mean, we have to make a forecast. But, at this point, a lot of it is informed speculation more than any kind of ability to really make a solid projection, database projection.
Right. And that diffusion of people and of dollars and of the, frankly, like, substitution and income effects therein have a real impact on the real economy and our lived experience. So I have to say, there's a great queue of questions here. Yeah. So I'm just going to run. Do you want me to go? We'll do it one by one. Is that all right?
Yeah, let's do
So,
one by one, yeah, because I won't
okay,
remember I won't remember.
perfect. So the first is, do you see any value in the State Financial Control Board stepping in to make budget decisions that may be politically infeasible for local politicians to do?
Oy, okay, well, that was a good question to start. Uh, so I think, so first of all, the Financial Control Board is made up of politicians, right? It's the governor, the mayor, the state controller, and my boss, the city controller, as well as 3 private members. So, nothing is free of politics. Um, in the past, for example, in the Koch administration, and Mayor Koch was sort of the first mayor really had to grapple with kind of getting from the post-fiscal crisis fiscal situation to budgets that were balanced according to the standard laid out in the Financial Emergency Act. Koch was delighted to blame things on the control board. The control board right now does not have the ability to impose a control period that used to exist. So in the period after the fiscal crisis, the control board had very, very, very extensive powers to approve the city's budget. They could abrogate or refuse to agree to labor contracts, for example, as well as any other contracts. So those powers don't exist anymore. The Financial Control Board came up in the context of Mayor de Blasio's request for borrowing authority, deficit borrowing authority. Just to be clear what our position was, the controller's position was on that. The controller's position was that deficit borrowing, paying back, for 20 years or 30 years, money that you borrow to pay for this year's expenses is problematic for a couple of reasons. One, it burdens future generation with paying the money back and limits their choices. We're still paying back money that we borrowed in the wake of 9/11. And two, deficit borrowing authority is, if it's necessary, if it's a bridge to a more stable fiscal situation. But there was nothing that indicated that to us that the mayor had a plan for how he was going to get to a fiscal situation for which a stable fiscal situation, a balanced, stable, structurally balanced budget, for which borrowing would be the bridge. So, we've been very reluctant to take a positive view about borrowing for now, at least until, there are circumstances which show us that there's really no other way. And there's a plan for how we would use that money to kind of get to the other side, as it were. I think, it's been our position that there are still, the mayor has not forced agencies to do the kind of really thorough, careful scrub of agency operations to identify efficiencies, and that there's still the possibility to find savings without, resulting in layoffs or deep service cuts that would be antithetical to really a full recovery of the city's economy and life as we know it. So I think there's more work to be done. There are plenty of tools. There's no great magic to balancing the budget. There are a limited number of ways to skin the cat. And we know what they are. We've been through this. So the pandemic and the health crisis may be kind of unprecedented for us, and the fiscal situation is not. We know how to get out of it, and I don't think that at the moment there's any particular need for anybody else to step in other than for the mayor and the city council and others to recognize what it is that the steps they need to take in order to get us to kind of the other side of this crisis.
Great, thank you. So I'm just going to keep moving on to the next question, and I'm going right in order with how they were received. Can you speak about the MTA budget gaps and how that will affect New York City's recovery?
Yeah, the MTA, I mean, the MTA's budget gaps are obviously bad. There's nothing that the city by itself can do to solve that budget gap. It's simply too big. And there's probably nothing that the state can do by itself to solve those budget gaps. It really is going to come down to federal aid. The alternative, and I think at the end of the day, probably what we'll get is some mix of cuts in service and federal aid. The cuts in service that are obviously too drastic will hamper our recovery because we're so dependent on the transit system for our economy. And so that's a real risk. I don't know, I don't know what to expect with that at the moment. And I imagine that it will be next year before, I was asked recently, like, when we issue bonds, we have a session where we sit with our bond counsel and go over kind of all the, the outlook and analysis of the city's financial and economic situation. And one of the questions that was asked was, what's the prospect for significant federal aid? And I'm like, you tell me, I don't know. But my guess would be that federal aid that provides significant assistance to state and local governments, including authorities like the MTA, will probably wait until next year. I think it's a little bit of a waiting game at this point, but it's
because of the reliance on a federal package in the next Congress and the next White House, and not something that's going to come out of whatever slim package. If we get, to your point, if we get a slim package before the end of the year that prevents catastrophe, maybe that's good, but we're not going to get MTA savings there, right? Yeah.
Everybody should move to Georgia and vote on January 5th. Is my conclusion.
Yeah. You mentioned a management gap. What would proactive, effective management of the city's finances look like in this moment?
So if, as I said, in the past, when you're facing an out year budget gap that is, by out year, I mean the next year, that is fairly significant, as this year's gap is, and when there are some significant risks weighing on the outlook that may or may not yet have been fully acknowledged because they're just too unknown in your financial plan, the traditional approach has been to start a savings plan in mid-year, which means basically you have to introduce it in the November budget modification to accumulate some savings in the current year that you can use to help balance next year, as well as savings in the next year. Those steps were not taken in this November plan, and I think it was a missed opportunity. I completely understand the desire to wait and see. But if we wait too long, we're going to run out of options. The longer we wait to address a budget gap, the deeper the cuts would have to be in order to close it. There are some revenue options that have been floated. We think that there are some revenue options that you could use as well that could, inflict. Nobody wants to raise revenues right now, raise taxes right now, but I think there are some options out there that would have a fairly minimal impact on the city's economy. Again, I don't think that's the first option. I think the savings is the first option, but and we have reserves. There's an art, some people might call it a dark art, but there's an art to managing the budget across a cycle, an economic cycle. And it means that we have to be forward looking and think about the future. And that's the whole sort of system that was put in place in the wake of the fiscal crisis, was really designed to do that. And we're kind of not really doing that right now. And I think we need to focus a little bit more on sort of planning ahead and acting to get ahead of the curve before the curve comes and smacks us in the face.
Well, especially to your point, as you sort of alluded to at the beginning, if we're seeing changes and there's a lag in the economic recovery. So if we're only at, and I don't know, the last number I saw was under 20% of office workers being back, and that may be more now, I'm not sure. But if that number stays, right, that certainly impacts over the next number of quarters our ability to raise revenue and start new business and things. So, okay, keeping moving here because I want to get through all these questions. How many of the 900,000 jobs that our city lost due to COVID-19 have been regained since the spring?
It's about 300,000, a little over 300,000 as of October.
Okay. If we think that the city's economy will be back, or at least close to the recent past, in the next 2 to 3 years, should we look at loans to help cover operating costs during this time of great need? I fear losing social services in the short term could harm the city's recovery and long-term prospects.
The city has limited ability to make loans to private entities. So I think one of the things that I think is, fairly urgently needed, quite urgently needed really, is an extension of the payroll protection program that was part of the CARES Act. And there were problems accessing it, and it needs to be more focused, obviously, on small and medium-sized businesses that really need it, than was perhaps the case the first go around. It was a brilliant part of that program was that it was available to nonprofits. So I know a lot of theater organizations, for example, took advantage of it. Some nonprofits took advantage of it. But it was extremely important, and now that money is gone, and people are still facing, limited ability to generate revenues. They just don't have the customer base. So I think an extension of that, refined somewhat to recognize the businesses that are most at risk right now, is really urgently needed. It's just something that, there's a proposal put forward by the Hospitality Alliance, for example, to allow restaurants to keep the sales tax that they collect. The challenge about that, of course, is it means that then we don't have the sales tax to use to finance social services and other programs. So, that's in effect alone. But what I think we have to just think about is, who do we want to? There's a lot of demand and there's a lot of need. And while I'm very sympathetic to the plight of restaurants, especially going into the winter here, there are other people who have a need for this as well. And I think it's something that we cannot solve by ourselves as a city or as a state.
So something, and it's funny, this is something that I've been talking to a lot of folks about, and I've been thinking about in terms of economic recovery. So it's not an answer to how we solve the sort of gap in between, but how do you think we can leverage quasi-public-private development corporation dollars, EDC dollars, state economic development dollars, et cetera? Are there, for lack of a better term, discretionary monies in those entities that could be used to help stabilize and recover certain industries in a creative way in whatever the post-crisis economy, COVID crisis, health crisis portion, at least of the economy is?
It's a good question. I don't know that I have a good answer to it. One of the problems with the New York City EDC in the past few years has been that the operation of the ferry system has eaten up a lot of its operating surplus, and that operating surplus used to go towards EDC projects or back to the general fund for use to finance operations. And so they have less ability to be helpful than they used to. There's just not, at this point, not a lot of discretionary money.
Right.
And I think that in some ways, from the city and the state just have limited ability, right? We can't print money, and we have to balance our budget. And in the city, we have to balance it to a very strict standard. The best thing that we can do, honestly, is to keep our fiscal house as in order as we can, and to manage our finances across, the next 2 to 3 years of transition until we're back to a fuller economic recovery. And that's never going to be a pain-free process. But you can sort of manage the pain if you're proactive about it. And I think that's what we really need to do urgently.
And managing the pain in the context of a crisis where we have industries that historically during recession may not have suffered. In fact, I forget the number, but realistically, almost all of the job growth nationally we've seen since the last crisis was driven by service job growth, right? So now it's like we're in a place where New York, the jobs we were really, that everyone was kind of dependent on for this economic job growth, right, is hindered in a way that it's interesting how the tools that we've developed haven't really, that we don't have the mechanisms for this particular type of crisis in the same way. It's been fascinating to watch. I have a couple more questions here folks have submitted if we can try to get through. So given what you said about the Koch era's post-fiscal crisis efforts, which included lots of rezonings and disposal of city-owned sites to give more tax revenue and square footage, do you anticipate there will be pressure to do the same now?
So the Koch era was a little bit different in that respect because there were a lot of vacant and abandoned properties that the city took. The process is called in rem. It's essentially a foreclosure process where the city takes possession and then was able to convert that into affordable housing. We don't, the last thing we have is an abundance of vacant housing at the moment. So that opportunity doesn't exist. I think there are some opportunities out there. There was probably, for just to cite one that's kind of been on my radar recently. There was probably some overcapacity of hotel construction prior to the pandemic. So even without the pandemic, there were some hotels rooms that were probably going to sit vacant and not get used. This would be a great moment, honestly, to buy some of those hotel properties up and turn them into supportive housing for single adults or even adult families. So there are definitely opportunities like that where the city could spend some money now, especially since it would be capital money, and take advantage of an opportunity that would help solve some longer term problems and meet a longer term need. One that's the problem of supportive housing for single adults has been with us for a while, and it hasn't really been solved or addressed as people had hoped and expected. And so I think that one's a very obvious and easy one example of something that could be done. Maybe harder in execution, in reality, of course, than it sounds when I'm describing it, but something worth exploring too.
Well, and it's interesting for you to illustrate the hotel example because candidly, right, a lot of those hotel rooms, that excess capacity were in these small, dense, as of right built hotels in M1 zones that are not paying high wages, and that the room rates are just as competitive with Manhattan hotels, and it undercuts the service, the floor for workers, the floor for the service guests require. And so it's interesting for you to raise that. That is an issue the city council brought up too, along with both the high end part of the hotel market, right, where you had condo conversions was, I know, something that was contentious too. Okay, so the next question here. This crisis seems to have brought down rent and housing prices, in parentheses, somewhat. Do you expect this to continue? Do you see this as a positive result in a rent overburdened city, or as a negative risk because it lowers the city's revenue from real estate?
So, I think, I mean, just to answer the second question first, I think it's overall the lowering rent in the city is a positive. I'm not sure that the part of the market where we've actually seen rents come down is the part where we need it most urgently. Um, rents may be down in some higher income parts of the city where, people were more mobile, frankly. And less so in parts of the city where people don't earn as much and still are faced with high rents and have not necessarily come down to the same extent. What we're really talking about here is sort of overall demand, which means population growth. There have been obviously a lot of stories about, people leaving the city. I think most recently there was a figure of about 300,000 people who had left the city and had their mail forwarded. That was kind of the metric that was being used. That's a lot of people. That's, a third. It's a significant number of people. Are they gone forever? Who knows? Are they coming back? Did they move out temporarily? These are questions that we don't know the answers to. We all have our anecdotes and our friends and people that we know who have made this or that or the other decision. Very hard to know sort of what this phenomenon ultimately looks like. So just to be completely anecdotal for a moment, my block, I saw moving vans from time to time during the spring into the summer. Now all I see is construction vans, construction vehicles. There's a lot going on in the city. And to make sense of what all of that really is going to shake out to, it's impossible right now. The one metric that will probably be most definitive, but which we won't see until next April or even after, is the number of income tax filers. And when we see how many people file their income taxes as New York City residents next spring, I think that'll be the most definitive indicator that we will have of sort of population changes. I still think there is an affordable housing problem regarding, even if the population permanently goes down by 300,000, I still think there's going to be an affordable housing problem that the next mayor is going to have to find a way to deal with. Especially for people, we've had a divergent, you talked about the service growth in the service economy, it's very divergent. You have sort of the lower wage in-person jobs, retail, restaurants, hotels, et cetera, that have been really extremely damaged by the pandemic. You have higher end service jobs and professional services, consultants, lawyers, accounting, et cetera, all of whom are very well paid, and whose ability to work from home has meant that they have not lost jobs at the same rate at all. So, the reality is that that's sort of our economy right now. Until we can find, a way nationally to raise the living standard of service workers on the bottom end, then we're going to have an affordable housing problem nationally as well, and it's most felt very acutely in New York City. So I think that's an ongoing phenomenon that is going to have to be addressed in terms of housing affordability.
Well, and I guess, something I've seen some articles about it, I'm sure you have too, is even in the higher end service industries is the sort of corporate right sizing that's happening. And again, to get back to the point of when you shut down the economy, when you tell people don't come to their offices, as people are working home longer and longer, and companies are sort of, reprioritizing maybe the arrangements they've set up, it'll be interesting to see how the fire industries play out in the long run too, and particularly with tax filings, all those, what's left in the fire industries for folks who actually file in New York, right? Like how it impacts those should be interesting too.
I think one of the phenomena that has been sort of interesting here is that there are huge job losses in retail and other personal services and accommodation and food services that bounced back, started to bounce back. By bounce back, I certainly don't mean they fully recovered, but it started to come back in the summer. Losses in the sort of higher paying professional services actually have not bounced back as much. They sort of continue at a slow trickle. So while they never were hurt as badly, they're also not coming back. And I think that's a phenomenon that we're going to keep a close eye on to see sort of how that develops.
And how it will change the bargaining power of those workers, right? Like even now, not even of just service workers and unionized workers, but of professional workers, right? If companies now are feeling more challenged, their margins are more challenged, what's the likelihood that the maximum match on a 401k stays around as a benefit? Which is something I think is probably going to go the way of the dodo, unfortunately. I don't know if we're at time, Sarah. Oh, one more question here. Do you have any preliminary data on Wall Street bonuses this year?
I have preliminary data on Wall Street profits. In the first half of the year, Wall Street profits were, don't quote me, but I think $27.5 billion, which is an extraordinary number. It's 80% above the profits the first half of 2019. The markets have been obviously kind of wacky this year. So we're expecting, the first 2 quarters of the year are actually pretty good predictors of the bonus pool later in the year. So I think we're expecting a good bonus pool this year, which is helpful to us in terms of our income tax revenues. I think it's a one-time. I think we have to be careful because I think it's going to be a one-time phenomenon. I don't expect that we're going to see the kind of crazy growth in the stock markets that we've seen, with a lot of volatility, obviously. But we broke 30,000 in the Dow. I don't expect to see those kinds of records getting set.
And how much of that was the SBA money that they got that we were, Can I ask you one last question before we close out? I know we're just about at time. So, you were around in the council a long time. You've worked in city government. We're coming up to a huge election cycle. This June is the primary. We have 500 some odd people running for council, mayor, comptroller. On this call right now, there are 70 participants. I would hope that some of these folks are either candidates for office themselves or working on volunteering on campaigns. What is it that you think, if there were 1 or 2 really poignant thoughts that our future prospective lawmakers at the local level should be considering and thinking about and keeping perspective on as we're walking into a new government, what would that be?
So I'm going to give one piece of advice to aspiring council members. If you're elected to office, your chances are you're going to get a committee assignment that you're not enthusiastic about. Find an area of expertise. Take the one you're given if you don't get the one you want, and make yourself the expert on it. That will make you very influential. Spend as much time as you can learning about it, and if you're the person in the council who's the recognized expert, that gives you a tremendous amount of influence. More broadly, I think there are a couple of things. I think we have to, one, we have to recognize the limits of city government and state government for that matter. We're not the federal government. We don't have the ability to deficit finance our way through a crisis. We have to manage our budget across the budget cycle. And that means, really resisting the temptation to spend all the money that comes in the door sometimes and squirreling some away to have for the future. It's always painful. 2008, 9, 10 were, much more painful than anybody would have liked, even with the stimulus funds from the Obama administration. Stimulus funds don't last. they're there for a year or two, and then you have to take that moment to get your own house in order, because when it goes away, if you haven't gotten your house in order, it's going to be even more painful. So I think it's just, we're going to be managing our budget for a couple of years through sort of the aftermath of this fiscal downturn. And I think it's just important to recognize the limits of what city government can do, and to recognize the need to sort of think across multiple years and think ahead and not just for the moment. And I think you also have to think about what it is that makes a city sustainable for everybody. And it's a complicated equation. It's a big city, but you really have to think as holistically as possible about what it is that makes the city a kind of value proposition for everybody, across across the spectrum of jobs, household situations, etc. So that's my sort of pandemic era fiscal crisis moment word of wisdom, I guess.
Fantastic. Well, Preston, thank you so much. Sarah, I believe we're at time now. I don't know if there are any, throw the ball back to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for coming. I saw 91 attendees at one point, which is truly amazing. Thank you, Alex, for being a dynamite moderator. And of course, Preston, for joining us today and breaking down this important issue that affects so many things in such a clear, concise way. I really appreciate it. And I know the audience does as well. Before we end, I just want to quickly highlight 2 upcoming ADME initiatives. So the first is that this December, we're asking you to show your support for New York City restaurants by taking a selfie with your restaurant menu or takeout bag and posting it on Twitter or Instagram with the tags A Better NY, New York City Alliance, and #DiningDecember. We'll repost everything and feature 1YP in our newsletter. And I also wanted to give you all a heads up of a really fun Spirit of ADME after party that we're planning on December 16th. We'll have a live DJ and great giveaways and more info to come on that. And yeah, that's all for today. Preston, thank you again so much. This was really, really wonderful and informative, and I hope everyone has a great day.